Hi, I'm Nicole Beery with the Illinois Center for Transition and Work. Today's webinar is going to focus on functional behavior assessments in the workplace. The objectives for this webinar are that you can describe the importance of appropriate behavior in the workplace, and that you can describe how to conduct ecological assessments and functional assessment interviews for work-based learning to assist transition personnel in conducting functional behavior assessments and then designing behavior support plans that will reduce challenging behavior. First, let's talk a little bit about the importance of appropriate behavior in the workplace. Well, as most of you know, the disparities for individuals with disabilities in terms of employment is very low. And so individuals with disabilities are employed at much lower rates, 17.9% compared to 61.8%. And the most frequently cited reason that our youth with disabilities are not able to gain or maintain employment is because of inappropriate social behavior. And students with disabilities who engage in challenging behavior during work-based learning experiences are at risk of being denied participation or even being terminated, which is a big problem considering that work-based learning experiences are a positive predictor of post-school success. One way to support students with challenging behaviors in the workplace is through ecological assessments. And ecological assessments are more of a preventative measure and are used to identify things that may cause students with disabilities to engage in that challenging behavior. And so by being proactive, we can identify potential triggers and alleviate them before they become problematic. And so what is an ecological assessment? Well, ecological assessments look at the relationship between people and the physical environment, and they're used to collect normative data of a desired behavior or activity to evaluate students' behavior. And those behaviors that are different from the norm sample suggest that there's a discrepancy and there may be a need for some kind of intervention. And ecological assessments can be used for many things. They can be used to examine job performance, to look at supervisor and coworker perceptions of work-related skills and interpersonal interactions. They can be used to identify challenging behavior in work-based settings that should be targeted for instruction, which is kind of what we're talking about today. And then they can be used to develop appropriate work-based behavior support plans for decreasing that challenging behavior and hopefully increasing positive workplace interactions. And a very common type of ecological assessment used in transition is called a discrepancy analysis. And it's used to gather relative information regarding behaviors and skills needed for exemplary performance. So what it does is it identifies specific problem behavior that it may be interfering with an exemplary performance. And it can be used to develop a sequence of socially appropriate behaviors in the form of a task analysis. And so what this looks like is, here's an example of an ecological assessment analysis form in the form of a discrepancy analysis that can be used to conduct this type of assessment. And so the steps for conducting a discrepancy analysis are: one is first to identify a setting, a job site. The second is to identify an activity to observe. And then you want to identify a model or an exemplar to observe, followed by observing the model performing the activity. And then you're going to review the assessment with the employer or supervisor. And then you're going to observe the performance of the student, complete the discrepancy analysis, and then you're going to make sure that you describe workplace cultural considerations and relationships between workers. So let's talk about these individually. So the first step is identifying work sites to assess. And work sites should be identified using job preference assessments. It should not be about convenience. We can't just go with put students in any work site just because an employer is willing to have our students. Instead, it needs to be more intentional, and it needs to be based off of students' interest. And also, the work sites should reflect that initial preference and interest of the student. And so I understand that sometimes that's not always possible. Sometimes we have to take what we can get, but I can tell you that you will eliminate a lot of challenging behavior just by choosing work sites that are of interest to students. And so I would highly recommend that you really take into consideration and try and find the best match possible to make sure that you are honoring the student's interest and preference. The second step is to identify activities to observe. So you want to observe and evaluate the relationships between the people, tasks, and the environment. And you're going to want to divide that workday into a natural sequence of activities or routines. So you don't want to start observing things halfway through a task. You want to make sure that you're observing things that are happening naturally throughout the day. And then you want to include mandatory tasks, mandatory social activities, and coworker interactions. For example, you might want to observe workers in the morning or before the shift starts, or maybe at the end of the day after the shift is over, just so you can get an idea of how employees are interacting with each other. The third step is to identify a model. So this is going to be your comparison, and you're going to want to discuss the range of acceptable performance with the employer ahead of time so they can help you identify a good model. And you want to ask the employer about any kind of social interactions, such as how workers interact during work time, break times. And during the assessment, you want to watch for those behaviors and any other aspects of the work culture, because that will be important later on. Step 4, you want to observe the model. So here you're going to note activities or routines, not just specific tasks. And you're going to want to identify activities and you're going to want to include the beginning phase of the task itself, any kind of interactions that occur during the task, the completion of the task, and then transition to the next activity. You're going to record the model's performance, and then you're going to make the observation as natural as possible. So we want to be very careful that we're not too close to the model, so that we don't want them to perform for us. We want to see what actually occurs in those settings. And then it's recommended that you conduct these observations on 3 different occasions to identify a pattern of behavior. And so what this looks like using an assessment form is, here in this column, you would record everything you observe the model doing in that activity. The next step is to review the assessment with employer. So after you have observed your model employee, you want to verify the accuracy of what you observed. You want to determine if the tasks and activities that you noted are things that usually happen in that setting. And then you also want to check to see if you've missed something important, any kind of important activities or interactions that occur. And then step 6 is you want to observe the performance of the student. So you want to review the essential functions and interactions at the work site with the identified job preference of the student. So here's where you would go back and you would look at everything you observed, and you would compare it to what the student's interests are. And if that's still a match, then you definitely want to go ahead and observe your student. And then, of course, you want to record the performance of the student engaging in the same task as or activity that you observe the model. And on the form right next to the model, you would record the performance of the student, and hopefully everything would align across there, that whatever you saw the model doing, you saw the student doing. Step 7, complete the discrepancy analysis. So as the student is engaging in those activities and performing tasks and interacting with coworkers, you're comparing their responses to that of the model. So you want to make sure that you're including comments about the discrepancy and noting any kind of specific areas the student will need additional support in. And this is really helpful if you know your student very well ahead of time. if you go to do these observations, you're going to know, you're going to pick up on certain things that could potentially be a problem for your student. And so what that looks like on an observation form is that you have your performance of the model, your performance of the target student, and then what you're doing is you're determining whether there's a discrepancy in what you saw the model doing compared to your student. So if there's no discrepancy, there would be a plus sign. And if there is a discrepancy, then you would mark a minus sign and then note what that discrepancy was. And finally, you want to describe the workplace culture. So you want to conduct multiple observations again to identify workplace culture considerations. And there are lots of complex relationships within the work setting. And so it's very important that you identify these ahead of time. And you want to identify how workers are behaving during the day and the kind of do's of the setting. I say do's because most likely you're not going to see the don'ts of the setting unless the model happens to make a mistake. But so really concentrate on what the do's are of the setting. And then finally, you want to identify coworkers that are willing to offer natural supports. These coworkers will be very important teachers to the student for learning the company culture, because you won't have that information, but employees who've been there a while will have that information. So you want to try and identify these coworkers right off the bat. So let's take a look at an example of a completed ecological assessment analysis. And so you'll see here, I have in red my performance of a model, and I have in blue my performance of my target student. And so this particular observation occurred at a Goodwill store where I'm observing a model employee checking out customers. And so when I observed my model, I observed them standing at the register waiting for customers, greeting customers and asking them how they are, picking up items and scanning them using the scanner, folding clothing items if there was clothing, using the intercom system appropriately to request customer assistance, responding to customers' comments appropriately, making small talk with customers while they were waiting for customer assistance. The employee had a lot of knowledge about the sales that the store had going on and was able to share that information with the customer. And I also observed the model answering customers' questions regarding the return policy. And so when I observed my student doing the same exact activity, I observed some different things. So in this case, my student was looking at a magazine and not really paying attention to whether customers were coming into the line. And when the customer did walk up, my student did not greet the customer. And when it was time to pick up the items and scan them, they were able to do that. And after they scanned the items, they would put them in the bag, but did not fold clothing items. During my observation of my student, the phone rang and the student answered the phone and then paged an employee to let them know that there was a call on line 1. And during that time, I noticed that the customer appeared really irritated. I also observed my student providing a comment to a customer. The customer wanted to know if there were ties to match a shirt they were purchasing. And my student told her that there were plenty of ties in the back. And then I did not notice my student, that is, making any kind of small talk. They did not share information about the sales. And then I also, though, did see my student answer the same question about the return policy. However, my student's response was not the same as the model employee's response. My student simply said, you can return things anytime you would like. And so after writing down all of my notes of what I observed, I'm going to go through and I'm going to decide whether or not there was a discrepancy. So for example, looking at the first row, the model was standing at the register waiting for customers, whereas my student was looking at a magazine, not paying attention. And so I would definitely say there was a discrepancy there, and I made a comment that my student was off task. For the next row, customer, the model employee greets the customer with a smile and asked them how they are. My student did not. So that was definitely a discrepancy. And so I made a note, did not greet customer, make eye contact. In the next row, the model employee picked up the items and scanned them using the scanner. And my student did that as well. And so there was no discrepancy there. And so I will give my student a plus. In the next row, we have folds clothing items. And however, my student did not fold the clothing items. And so I made a note here that my student needs some more skill development in folding. And so you can see here, you simply go through and you decide whether or not your employees' skills match that of the model. And if they did not, you simply put a minus and then you make a note of what those discrepancies were. So let's talk about some considerations regarding ecological assessments. So first, it's important to note that students have to have a way to communicate about their experience. So just like preference assessments, ecological assessments cannot be completed without the student having a way to communicate with the people they interact with at the employment site. And so, they have to be able to communicate with individuals outside of the environment, also who are offering them support. It's also important to think about the work sites that you're selecting. Remember, they have to match the student's preference based off assessments, or as close to as possible, because that's going to eliminate a lot of challenging behavior. And you want to allow time during the observation to really understand the social and cultural aspects of the workplace. And then something that is very important for you to know is that ecological assessments do not identify the function of challenging behavior. So they are not going to tell you why a student's engaging in those behaviors. Rather, this is a way for you to identify potential challenges or just to identify things that are occurring in the workplace. It is not going to give you an in-depth analysis of why the student's engaging in that behavior. So, but we're going to talk about that moving forward. So sometimes we have students with behaviors that are more challenging and require a functional behavior analysis. Here, we need to identify the function, why the student's engaging in the behavior, in order to identify a more appropriate replacement behavior and develop a behavior support plan. So a functional behavior assessment is a process that's used to gather information about the function the behavior serves for the student. And this process helps to identify behaviors that serve the same function as the challenging behavior. And this is what is used to develop behavior support plans. And so there's three pretty common functions of behavior. There's gaining attention, maybe escaping a task, a certain situation or certain people, or receiving a tangible or sensory feedback of some sort. Those are just common functions of behavior. Sometimes it may be something else. Sometimes it may be one or more of these things. So keep that in mind as well. These are just three pretty common ones that we see. And so to conduct an FBA, it requires you to collect both direct and indirect information. And direct information is usually gathered through direct observations, like what we just talked about, ecological assessments, and indirect information. And that can be through structured interviews, mental health records, and the student's IEP. And there are 6 primary outcomes of an FBA. One is to develop a clear description of the challenging behavior. The second is to identify the antecedents that are predicting the challenging behavior. And the third is to identify setting events that predict when the behavior is likely to occur. The fourth is to identify consequences that keep maintaining the challenging behavior. The fifth is to develop a hypothesis or a summary statement for why the student's engaging in that behavior. And then last, observational data is collected to confirm whether or not the hypothesis was correct or not. And so to talk about this, we are going to use a case study, and I am going to go through the process of conducting a function-based interview. And this is part of that indirect data that you will need to collect in order to conduct an FBA. So let's talk a little bit about our case study. So Tony is a 17-year-old high school junior, and he's doing an internship currently at a local bowling alley, and he is supported by his job coach, Karen. Tony works 3-hour shifts 3 times a week, cleaning bowling lanes after groups finish bowling. And Tony has had really great attendance. He dresses appropriately for work. He comes in with clean work shirt and it's ironed and he's ready to go. And Tony is really eager when you give him opportunities to learn new tasks. And however, Tony frequently refuses to complete non-preferred tasks by leaving his work area. So to give you some observation and background data on Tony, Karen has observed Tony refusing to complete non-preferred tasks, leaving his work area, playing on his phone, and picking his nose. And Tony's behaviors often happen when he's asked to clean the bowling lanes after groups have finished bowling. And Karen has done an ecological assessment on Tony in the past, and a work plan was created where Tony was not allowed to have his cell phone on him while at work. Removing his cell phone did not eliminate his refusal behavior. Instead, it increased the amount of time he spent picking his nose instead. So to help us accomplish those 6 primary outcomes we talked about, we're going to use a functional assessment interview for work-based learning form. And the form is downloadable alongside the link to this webinar. And there is a link here on the slide. And so the first part of the form looks at the students' job skills, their strengths. And so what you want to do is you want to first start off by identifying at least 3 contributions or strengths the student brings to the work setting. And then you're going to rate those top 3 strengths and describe how each one of them look. And this information is going to be essential later on when you go to develop your effective behavior support plan. And using the document that I just shared with you, this is what it would look like. So the students' job skills are their strengths. You put an X next to the ones that apply, and then you go ahead and rate them. In Tony's case, we know that he has really good attendance. He has a lot of willingness to learn new things, and he has appropriate work attire. And so in Tony's situation, his first top strength is good attendance. That's number 1. It's followed by willingness to learn and then appropriate work attire. I said those in the correct order, but they aren't necessarily going to be in the correct order. And something I really love about this form is if you know your student's strength is something that is not listed here, there is plenty of space for you to add things, and you can customize it to your student. And so the next part of the interview process is to come up with a clear description of the challenging behavior. So for each behavior, you want to describe what it looks like, how often it's happening per day, week, or month, how long in duration the behavior lasts when it occurs, and then the intensity in which the behavior occurs. So in terms of low, medium, or high. And so some additional things for you to think about when you're identifying these behaviors and defining them is, do any of the problem behaviors in the workplace happen together or at the same time? Is there a predictable sequence or chain that happens? And if so, you want to note which problem behaviors and the order that they occur. Something else to think about is, of those behaviors, which one is the most important or the primary problem behavior that must be addressed first, and in what setting? And so looking at the document, that looks like this. So in Tony's situation, his behavior is task refusal. And what that looks like is he'll say, I'm not doing that, and he'll leave the work area. This occurs 4 to 6 times, and it lasts about 5 to 15 minutes each time. And in terms of intensity, this behavior is very intense. The other behavior is off task. And what this looks like is he's playing with his cell phone, and this can occur 4 to 6 times, last about 5 to 10 minutes, and this is moderately intense. And the last behavior is picking his nose. So after being told to put his phone away, he will pick his nose. And this happens at least 2 times per shift, lasts about 2 to 3 minutes, but is less intense. And so thinking about those considerations, do any of those behaviors happen together at the same time, a predictable sequence? In Tony's case, yes. It starts with task refusal, then he gets out his phone, and if he's told to put his phone away, he'll pick his nose. And so of those primary problem behaviors, which one is the most important, the primary problem behavior? Well, in Tony's case, I go up and I look, and if I'm looking at how intense these behaviors are, task refusal is the most intense. And so that is going to be my primary problem behavior that I'm going to want to address first. Next, you're going to want to look at the antecedents. The antecedents are those things that occur right before the behavior happens, the conditions that impact or evoke the behavior. And you want to consider what situations and settings make the behavior most likely to occur. So thinking about the time of day, the setting, people involved in the activity. And some things you're going to want to think about are there any situations or events that sometimes seem to set off the behavior? Maybe there's a particular coworker that sets the student off, or a certain job demand, noises in the environment, whatever. And of the immediate antecedents, which is the most important influencer to trigger that primary problem behavior in the work setting? So in Tony's case, the time of day is refusals can occur throughout any time during that 3-hour shift. And the likelihood is about a 3. And so for setting, after each group has left the bowling lane and seating area is likely when we're going to see that behavior. And there is a high likelihood of a number 5 here, that if that is the situation or the setting, we're going to see that behavior. And the people that are involved here is the job coach, Karen. And when she asks him to put his phone away, and that's about a 2. And then the activity is when he's asked to clean trash from the seating and bowling areas. And there is a high likelihood that that problem behavior is going to occur when that happens. And so thinking about those considerations, are there any situations or events that are not listed that sometimes set off the behaviors? In Tony's situation, no, there's not. However, if there were, you would go ahead and note those there. And then of those immediate antecedents above, what is the most important influencer that's going to trigger the primary behavior? Well, if I go up and I look at the likelihood, the number ratings that I gave, it looks like the setting and activity are the most important influencers that are going to predict when the behavior is going to occur. And so next we're going to look at those setting events. And the setting events are going to be what predicts when the challenging behavior is likely to occur. And so you want to define ecological events that predict or make the challenging behaviors more likely to occur. What makes the behavior worse? So for example, it may be a lack of sleep the night before. It may be the student doesn't feel well. Maybe there was a conflict at work, or maybe they're hungry. And some things to think about are, of those ecological events or setting events, what is the most important influencer that makes the problem behavior more likely to occur in the work setting? And so in Tony's case, sometimes if he shows up not feeling well, it's usually because he didn't eat food with his meds. And when that happens, there's about a moderate likelihood that the problem behavior is going to happen. And then another thing is forgetting to take his medication altogether. And when that happens, there's a really high likelihood of 4 that the problem behavior is going to happen. And so if I think about the setting events, the most important influencer for the primary problem behavior to occur, it's usually if he has forgotten to take his medication. So next we want to look at those consequences and consequences that maintain the challenging behavior. So the functions the behavior serves for the student in particular situations. And then what makes the problem behavior in the workplace continue to reoccur. And these things could be naturally occurring or manufactured. And when you're identifying the function, you're identifying the reasons for why the student is engaging in the behavior, what is being obtained or what is being avoided. And in Tony's situation, his problem behavior of task refusal, what is happening here is he's using it to escape, right? He doesn't want to do the task. And off-task behavior, again, he's doing it to avoid completing the task. And same with picking his nose. All 3 behaviors are to avoid or escape completing a task. And next, we want to look at the efficiency of the behavior. So how efficient is the behavior for the student to get or avoid a particular consequence? And we determine efficiency based on how much physical effort is required, how often the behavior is performed before it's rewarded, and how long the student has to wait to get the reward. And in Tony's case, the primary problem behavior of task refusal, it's pretty efficient. He doesn't have to put a whole lot of physical effort into it, but he gets his reward right away because he walks away and refuses, and so he's not completing the task. So I would say that his primary problem behavior of task refusal is pretty efficient for him. You're also going to want to document previous attempts. So you want to identify any kind of interventions or changes that have been made to the student's routine that have attempted to address or eliminate the challenging behavior. So you want to identify the problem behavior, the work situation, what you changed, and what was the result of that change. So in Tony's situation, if you remember, an ecological assessment was done. So in the past, they have addressed task refusal in the work situation of cleaning the bowling lanes by removing his cell phone. And the result of that was it only increased his nose picking. So now that we have gathered all of that information, we can develop a hypothesis statement. And the hypothesis statement is basically just summarizing the setting events, the antecedent events, the problem behavior, and the consequences. So you're taking all of the information from questions C, B, A, and D, and you're summarizing them. So here, all I did was take the information from sections B, C, A, and D, and I just summarized them. And so for the setting event, in Tony's situation, forgetting to take his medication or taking his medication on an empty stomach is often going to increase the likelihood that the student is going to engage in their problem behavior. But if I didn't have enough information gathered to summarize what this setting event was, I could consider conducting a setting event assessment. Next, looking at the triggering antecedent or all of the information from question B, I'm summarizing that in Tony's situation, when he's asked to complete a non-preferred task like cleaning bowling lanes in the seating area, that is usually the triggering antecedent that is going to cause the behavior. But if I didn't have enough information, I could consider conducting a routine analysis. And so the problem behavior, this was from question A, all I did was summarize this. And in Tony's case, he is likely to refuse to work and leave the work area. That's what the behavior looks like. And then, but if I didn't know that information, something you might consider doing is conducting a direct observation or more direct observations. And then last, maintaining consequences. all of that information came from question D. And in Tony's situation, maintaining the consequence for him is in order to escape a non-preferred or difficult task. But if I didn't know that information, something I could do is conduct an escalating chain response class, and that would give me more information to be able to identify what was maintaining the consequence for Tony. And last, you're going to confirm the hypothesis, and you're going to do that by collecting observational data, and you're just going to conduct a direct observation using an observation form similar to how we did with the ecological assessment. And then the form takes you to this nice competing pathways analysis. And if you're not familiar with the competing pathways analysis, all it is it's a link between the FBA and the development of the behavior support plan. And the problem behaviors are going to be replaced by alternatives that are going to successfully compete with the function of the student's behavior. So that's kind of where the name of competing pathways comes from, is that you want to identify replacements or alternative behaviors that are going to compete for the same function. And what you're going to do in the process is you're going to identify strategies that are going to neutralize the setting event, make those challenging behaviors irrelevant, teach more appropriate behavior, and increase alternative behavior while decreasing the problem behavior. And so let's look at Tony. So in Tony's case, I'm taking all of the information that I have gathered this far, and I'm going to fill in these boxes to try to identify a new alternative behavior. So currently, what is making the behavior more likely, or the setting event for Tony, is that forgetting to take his medicine or not feeling well because he took medicine on an empty stomach. And the triggering antecedent, what sets off the behavior, is when he's asked to complete a non-preferred task like cleaning up the trash. And what currently is happening, the behavior that we are seeing, is that he refuses to complete tasks and leaves the work area. And what's maintaining that, what's keeping that behavior happening, is to avoid completing non-preferred tasks. But the desired behavior is for Tony to complete tasks without any refusal. And the consequence or result of the desired behavior would be positive praise from the employer. And so moving down to the bottom here, a more appropriate way to meet that need is to appropriately request short breaks when he's frustrated, or if he, thinks a task is too difficult. So I need to teach him to appropriately request short breaks. Let's look at some strategies for Tony. So for setting event strategies, remember, we're looking at ways to neutralize the setting events. And in Tony's case, I'm going to use prompting and I'm going to provide him with a reminder alarm for him to remember to eat and take his medication before coming to work. And for the predictor strategies, remember, I'm focusing on ways to make the problem behavior irrelevant. I'm going to modify or eliminate predictors. I'm going to intersperse preferred tasks with non-preferred tasks throughout the work shift. And some instructional modifications I'm going to make is I'm going to have Tony track the number of tasks he completes and have him use a rating scale to identify his level of enjoyment and the difficulty of the task. And then behavioral strategies, remember, this is where you're focusing on teaching more appropriate behavior. I'm going to teach Tony to ask for short breaks when he feels tasks are too difficult or he becomes frustrated, and then have him record and self-monitor each break. I'm also going to teach and strengthen his adaptive skills by teaching him to request a break in appropriate ways. And then for consequence strategies, I'm going to focus on increasing the alternative behavior and decreasing the problem behavior. And in Tony's case, I'm going to increase positive reinforcement for the desired alternative behavior by praising Tony for completing non-preferred tasks, or if he requests a break. And I'm going to teach Tony to use a self-management sheet to track his request for breaks and to self-reward. And then I'm going to make sure that I'm not praising refusal behaviors. And so now let's talk a little bit about developing behavior support plans. And we're not going to go through the entire process because there just isn't time, but there are some things that are important to discuss in regard to behavior support plans in the workplace versus the classroom. And so what behavior support plans do are they reduce the likelihood of the behavior reoccurring. And they're used to teach suitable and more efficient replacement behaviors that are going to meet the same function as that challenging behavior. And it targets the problem behavior and the behavior of others. So not just the student, but of others. So transition personnel, employers, coworkers, anybody working with the student. And the behavior support plan is going to describe how changes to the environment are going to help the student and result in that desired change that we're looking for. And behavior support plans are very different. They vary greatly. And it's going to depend on the student, the behavior, and the setting. So, for example, things that occur at a bowling alley look very different than they do in a coffee shop. So each behavior support plan is going to look different. And each setting is going to have different environmental triggers. So noises that you hear in a bowling alley are not the same noises that you hear at a coffee shop. And so I'm going to keep those things in mind and realize that, each behavior support plan is going to look very different for each student. But a quality behavior support plan should consider the contextual fit. So you need to take into consideration the values of the work-based setting, resources that are available to support staff, skills or behavior expertise of the staff who are responsible for implementing the behavior support plan. To give you an example to think about why the contextual fit matters, if you wanted to implement a check-in and check-out sheet with an employer as a replacement behavior, but you know that the employer is not around during those times that the student is working, that particular intervention is not going to be very effective given the context, because you know that the employer is not going to be around to check in or check out. Therefore, you need to take into consideration the setting and the contextual fit before you choose a strategy to make sure that it aligns with the, what goes on in the workplace. And so it's very important that you develop buy-in if you want your behavior support plans to be effective. So behavior support plans need to focus on the student's personality, their specific characteristics, their abilities, and their strengths. And this is going to make the interventions more likely to be implemented effectively. It's also important to utilize information that you learn through the FBA process regarding the student's strengths, because this is going to increase the likelihood of long-term maintenance, meaning the student is going to continue to maintain the new appropriate behavior you've taught them. And developing buy-in, again, focusing on the student's strengths. This is going to allow for modification of the work setting to develop learning opportunities for students, not just students, employers and coworkers. And it's going to allow you to build those job skills the student believes are a personal strength. So for example, working with bowling mechanisms, delegating tasks to coworkers, self-managing job responsibilities. So all of those things you can modify in the work setting around the student's strengths. And then practicing personal strengths through behavior support plans is going to make it much easier to maintain by using more natural and immediate reinforcers. For example, getting positive work performance feedback, earning more pay, or more autonomy. So those natural immediate reinforcers are going to be more likely to happen. And some things for you to think about. You want to make sure to include multiple staff in the development and maintenance of the behavior support plan, because this is going to ensure that the interventions are based on the function and are centered around the student's strengths. And also, it's important that transition personnel collaboratively contribute to the student's behavior support plan, because that's what's going to lead to long-term maintenance. So some key takeaways from today's webinar are that students with disabilities who engage in challenging behavior during work-based learning experiences are at a high risk of being denied participation or even being terminated. And ecological assessments is something you can use to identify challenging behavior in work-based settings that should be targeted for instruction or maybe future skill development. And some students may need a more targeted function-based approach through an FBA to identify the function of their behavior. And then finally, behavior support plans need to focus on student strengths and should be developed as a team in order to increase buy-in and maintenance. I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Thank you.